Hey everybody, as of Thursday, my flesh prison completed another revolution around the sun, so I decided to go ahead and take a look at The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Originally released for Nintendo 64, but later re-released on the GameCube, and was eventually remade for the 3DS, with the incredibly clever title of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D. And while I will include some footage of the 3DS remake for comparison's sake, and I will talk about the 3DS remake, most of what you're going to be seeing throughout this video is going to be of the GameCube version, which, apart from running at 640 by 480 and supporting progressive scan, is just a port of the original Nintendo 64 version. I'll talk about that more in a moment, though. For now, though, let me go ahead and introduce a game which most people would say needs no introduction, but you have to remember that we're going on 24 years since this game originally released, and a lot of people watching this video may not have ever had an opportunity to give it a try, so let's just go ahead and set the stage a bit here. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is the 5th overall entry in the Legend of Zelda series, 4th if you only count the mainline console entries, and it is the first game in the entire series to be entirely 3D, both graphically and functionally. You see, previous to this, it was all 2D, from either a top-down perspective in the case of the original Legend of Zelda, as well as A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening, or as a 2D side-scroller in the case of Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. And if you're curious about any of those, I have videos already on the original Legend of Zelda as well as Zelda 2 and A Link to the Past, but I have yet to cover Link's Awakening. I will eventually be covering that, but it will be the remake of that, which is Link's Awakening DX, which is the version most people actually remember of that game, but we'll get there when we get there. As for Ocarina of Time, however, it originally released in 1998 to ridiculous amounts of acclaim, and over the years has gradually become considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest, games of all time. It was a commercial success in its time, and it was later bundled together with GameCubes as part of the Legend of Zelda Collector's Edition, which also included the original Legend of Zelda, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, and the follow-up to this, which was the Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, which I will be looking at some other time. In addition to the Collector's Edition release on the GameCube, there's also an alternate version of the game called Master Quest, so full title being The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time Master Quest. And you can think of that as Ocarina of Time's equivalent to the second quest in the original Legend of Zelda, where if you entered in the proper name, then you would get an alternate version of the game which had the same plot and same general progression, but things were placed in different locations and the difficulty was higher. Same kind of thing with Master Quest. It's basically just a remix of the original version of Ocarina of Time, with things placed in different locations and a difficulty increase overall. And unfortunately, I won't really be talking about that in this video because I don't have a copy of it. As I said, I have the GameCube version, which came with my GameCube, and I have the 3DS remake because I was actually able to find a copy of that for pretty cheap. And that's just not really the case with Master Quest. I will eventually track down a copy of it, and maybe I'll do a video on that specifically then, but for now, we're just gonna talk about the original game on the N64, the GameCube port, and then, of course, the 3DS remake. Speaking of the 3DS remake, that released in 2011, and it was also a pretty big success. Not only was it well received critically, but it was also a commercial success, just like the original game was, although it didn't sell quite as well as the original game did. And it's frequently been held up as an example of how to do a remake correctly versus the frequent thing we see with remakes where they just kind of butcher it. But we'll get to that more in a moment. The thing is that the 3DS remake has never been ported to any other system, whereas the original Ocarina of Time for Nintendo 64 has. Obviously it got ported over to GameCube, but it also got a release on the Wii and Wii U Virtual Consoles, both of which are shutting down, so there's not really a way to get those versions anymore. And more recently, Nintendo put out their Nintendo Switch Online Plus expansion pack service, which includes Nintendo 64 games, of which Ocarina of Time is one of them, but I was seeing some issues with the way it ran on the Switch when it first released. I don't know if they have remedied those or not, seeing as how I don't have the Nintendo Switch Online Plus expansion pack service, so I can't just check it myself. But I did see that they were making some progress with it a while back, so hopefully they've ironed out those issues and it is actually a fully playable, fully realized version of the original Nintendo 64 game. So the release history is a bit of a mess with this one, but at least it is still available, even if that availability is wrapped up in an obnoxious subscription service these days. But there are some questions that need to be answered with it before you go trying to track down a used copy, or maybe even a new copy if you manage to get lucky, or of course help determine whether or not the expansion pack service is worth it to you. And some of those questions might seem a bit harsh, like how is the game in general, both as an action-adventure game and more particularly as an early 3D action-adventure game? How is it by the standards of its day, and does it hold up all these years later? And how is the remake? Does that manage to improve upon the original, maybe fix some issues that the original has? Or does something else entirely happen? Well, let's just go ahead and start delving right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation. Now, you do have to keep in mind that this game originally runs in a 4:3 resolution, and specifically on the GameCube, it is 640x480, which is a higher resolution than it ran on the actual N64. Although performance is pretty much identical across both systems. Which is to say that the original version of the game and the GameCube version really don't run well at all. They ran at about 20 frames per second if you were lucky. Sometimes they went lower than that, in fact quite often they went lower than that. And while it is definitely a playable game, it's a very choppy looking game as a result. And while people more or less expected that kind of thing from so-called cutting edge games back in 1998, which technically Ocarina of Time was, these days we definitely expect a hell of a lot better in terms of frame rates, and the frame rate in Ocarina of Time's original version and the GameCube version is just really rough to go back to. That is not the case with the 3DS version, however, which runs at a very smooth 30 frames per second. It could be better, of course, it could be 60 frames per second, but at least it's 30 frames per second smooth at all times, so you're not having to deal with that really choppy look and choppy movement that you had to put up with in the original N64 version and the GameCube port. And that's with a significant graphical upgrade as well. The original N64 game and the GameCube port look pretty rough. We're dealing with very low-res textures, very blocky modeling, very clunky-looking animations, which admittedly were quite good for their time, but have aged very poorly. And that's really just the way you could describe this game in general. It looked great back in 1998, but like with pretty much every 3D game from that era, the graphics have just aged extremely poorly. They do certainly have a nostalgic charm about them, and they are stylized enough to where it's not that big of a deal. I mean, they are rather cartoony visuals, so it's definitely aged a lot better than the likes of, say, Tomb Raider. But going back to these visuals after playing more modern games, or even games that were released only a year or two later, is pretty rough. That's not the case, however, with the 3DS version. Not only does it run a hell of a lot better, and thus by default basically wins, but the actual texture quality is a lot better, the modeling's a lot better, the animations are far smoother and even more detailed than the original game, and everything just looks nicer in general. I mean, the original game had pre-rendered backgrounds that were just static images, and those have aged especially poorly over the years, even compared to other games that used pre-rendered backgrounds. And that's not what the 3DS version uses. It actually models the environments, so they look consistent with the rest of the visuals, and they hold up a lot better. Now, of course, this did come at the cost of messing around with the art design a bit, which in some cases makes it look a bit better, and in other cases makes it look worse. So your mileage is definitely going to vary on that, whether you're an Ocarina of Time purist or not. But generally speaking, the 3DS remake not only looks better, but it runs better and is going to be much more accessible to a modern audience than the original N64 version especially, but even to a slightly lesser degree, the GameCube version. The sound design, on the other hand, is rather consistent across both games, although they did make some slight tweaks to the way the music sounds in the 3DS version, which you're not really going to notice unless you have really good headphones on and you're really paying attention. but it does make a very slight difference for people who are big fans of Ocarina of Time and would notice that kind of thing. The rest of what you're dealing with there is pretty decent stuff. The sound effects themselves all function perfectly fine. There's nothing amazing about them, but they all get the job done decently. And there's not really any voice acting to speak of. There is a bunch of yelling and grunting and that sort of thing, but no actual spoken lines. So there's really not all that much to talk about there. But then there is, of course, the soundtrack, which does commit a cardinal sin for any Legend of Zelda game as far as I'm concerned, which is that it does not have the classic overworld theme in it. You know, that classic tune that whenever you hear it, you instantly get psyched up for adventure? Yeah, this one doesn't have that. That's not to say that the soundtrack is bad or anything, because it's not. It's a fantastic soundtrack. Koji Kondo did an absolutely fantastic job with the music for this game, and a lot of it has become absolutely iconic, not just for the Zelda series, but for video games in general. I mean, whether or not you've played Ocarina of Time, chances are you've heard at least a few of the tracks from it, like, say, the Gerudo Valley theme, or the Song of Storms, or the Lost Woods theme, also known as Saria's Song. But if you asked me for my favorite tune in the entire soundtrack, it'd be one that I think most people would be a bit surprised by, which is the Spirit Temple theme. But regardless of what music is playing at what particular moment in the game, it all has that same kind of vibe that the soundtracks of the original Legend of Zelda, to a slightly lesser degree Zelda 2, and especially A Link to the Past all had, which is to say it makes you feel like you're going on an adventure. And when you bring all of the presentation together, you end up with something that is very much a product of its time. On the one hand, it looked fantastic back in 1998, but the visuals have aged very poorly despite the art design remaining strong all these years later. And while the 3DS remake does mess around with the art design a bit, it doesn't do it enough to where it ruins the entire experience, and those much improved visuals and especially the improved frame rate really help. And as for the sound design, well, it still holds up regardless of which version you're playing. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that Link has grown up in the Kokiri Forest with a bunch of what are effectively forest sprites, and he has been rather unusual this entire time because all of the other Kokiri have fairies, whereas Link does not. And so he is known as the boy without a fairy. And eventually, the Great Deku Tree, which watches over the Kokiri and the forest, calls upon the fairy Navi to find Link and bring him to the Deku Tree, so that the Deku Tree can inform Link of what is ultimately his destiny, to save the lands of Hyrule from an encroaching evil known as Ganondorf, a Gerudo man from the deserts who wields immense power and ultimately was able to curse the Deku Tree to death regardless of what Link is actually able to do to try to stop the curse. After dealing with the curse of the Deku Tree, Link leaves the Kokiri village and makes his way over to Hyrule Town, where he ultimately meets with Princess Zelda of Hyrule, who tells him that Ganondorf is trying to find his way into the Sacred Realm and gain access to the Triforce, which has the power to grant the wishes of whoever wields it. The legend there goes that if someone pure of heart gains access to the Triforce and their wishes are granted, then Hyrule will be led to a new age of prosperity, whereas if someone wicked gains access to the Triforce, then it will bring ruin upon the world. So Zelda forms a plan with Link to where he will venture off in the lands of Hyrule to gather the 3 sacred stones, one of which he gained after cleaning out the Deku Tree. And while Link is off doing that, Zelda will protect the Ocarina of Time, an artifact that's been safeguarded by the royal family for generations, and which, when combined with the 3 sacred stones, can potentially open the door to the Sacred Realm and thus the Triforce. So their idea is ultimately to get to the Triforce before Ganondorf is able to. Unfortunately, things don't really go according to plan, and even though Link is able to gather all 3 of the Sacred Stones, and ultimately is given the Ocarina of Time by Zelda, when he opens the Door of Time in the Temple of Time, which will ultimately lead to the Sacred Realm, he finds that it leads to a pedestal with a sword planted in it. This is the Master Sword, a legendary blade of evil's bane. and when Link goes and grabs the sword and pulls it out of the pedestal, it turns out that Ganondorf followed Link into this area and ultimately gained access to the Sacred Realm and thus the Triforce. Meanwhile, Link wakes up in a very unfamiliar and strange place, where he encounters someone named Rauru who explains that he is one of the 7 sages that protect the entrance to the Sacred Realm, that it's been 7 years since Link grabbed hold of the Master Sword and pulled it out of the pedestal, and that his spirit was sealed away for those 7 years until he was old enough to successfully wield the sword. In the time that has passed, Ganondorf has taken over Hyrule and brought ruin to the lands, and it's ultimately up to Link to gather all of the 7 sages so that their powers combined can help imprison Ganondorf in the Sacred Realm, thus hopefully restoring order to Hyrule. In other words, it's very reminiscent of A Link to the Past. You have sort of the mechanic of the Dark World and the Light World, only in this particular case, it's Hyrule in the grim dark future versus Hyrule in the current time that you start the game out in. And instead of rescuing all of the descendants of sages, Link is having to gather all of the current sages together so that they can combine their powers to seal Ganondorf away. It's really not all that strong of a storyline. It certainly gets the job done, and it sets the stage for adventure, but if you've played A Link to the Past, then the storyline is going to be something you're pretty familiar with. But even if you haven't played A Link to the Past, the story in this is going to be very straightforward, very easy to understand, and also not really surprise you at all. The thing is, this was still the 90s, so that's not all that much of an issue. Most games around that era were still gameplay focused more than anything else, and Ocarina of Time is really no exception there. This of course leads me to the most important thing about The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, and what will ultimately determine whether or not it is actually still worth playing, if it was even worth playing in the first place: the gameplay. Now, something you need to keep in mind as I talk about this is that at the time Ocarina of Time released in 1998, full 3D action-adventure games were still a very new thing. The genre was still being figured out, and as such, Nintendo had some pretty hefty obstacles to overcome. First, they had to translate the gameplay style of the previous Zelda games, all of which were 2D, into 3D, and on top of just figuring out the general ideas for doing so, they also had to make it all work. Were they successful at this? Well, let's put it this way. If you've played an action-adventure game in the years since Ocarina of Time released, chances are you've experienced mechanics that may not necessarily have been entirely introduced by Ocarina of Time, but were certainly popularized by it. In an era where a lot of games were still using tank controls, or something similar to tank controls, Ocarina of Time had basically free movement with an automatically adjusting camera. Where other 3D action-adventure games might have auto-targeting, Ocarina of Time has manual targeting with the use of what is called Z-targeting. You hold down the Z button on the Nintendo 64, or different buttons depending on which other system you're on, and the game will automatically lock on to one of the nearest either enemies or objects or NPCs or whatever happens to be around. And once it locks onto that thing, then Link's movement becomes dependent on the position of that thing. So if, say, it locks onto an enemy, you can start strafing around that enemy and jump around them, do side attacks on them, that sort of thing, all in a quick, easy to learn, and actually quite functional package. It's actually legitimately impressive to this day just how good the Z targeting in Ocarina of Time is, given that it is one of the earliest examples of that style of lock-on mechanic. I mean, there are still games to this day that struggle with this kind of thing, and Ocarina of Time makes it look fairly easy. That's not to say that the lock-on mechanics in Ocarina of Time are perfect. They're certainly not. Sometimes they will lock onto things you don't really intend to lock onto, and there's not really an easy way to switch between targets without just unlocking and then locking back in. And there are especially a bunch of issues where the lock-on interferes with the camera, because it does shift the camera perspective when you do that, and the new camera position might make it a lot more difficult to see what you're doing. And at the end of the day, this game still doesn't have full camera controls. You're relying entirely on it automatically adjusting to what you really are trying to do, and that doesn't always work. Similarly, while context-sensitive actions all being bound to single buttons are just a commonplace thing these days, Back when Ocarina of Time released, that really wasn't the case, and it helped to popularize that as well. Much like with the Z targeting, it's actually quite impressive just how well that holds up all these years later, given that it was such an early attempt at that kind of thing. And for the most part, it does show the context-sensitive actions that you are trying to do without forcing you to do the awkward shuffling around trying to figure out which angle and which position you need to be in order for the context-sensitive action to pop up. That's not to say you never have to do this awkward shuffle, but it's surprising just how few times you have to do it in this game. So they managed to get two very major core elements right off the bat, but what about the rest of the gameplay mechanics? Well, one of the bigger tasks they had is how they were going to handle combat, because the original Legend of Zelda on up through technically Link's Awakening DX all had very simple combat systems. The original Legend of Zelda was just you pressed a button and then Link would attack with the sword, and if he had full health, then it would shoot a sword beam out. Zelda 2 did more or less the same thing, but in 2D side-scroller format instead of 2D top-down, and then A Link to the Past would expand upon things a bit by adding in a sort of arc to the attack, which was now a slash instead of just a straight thrust, and you could hold down the attack button to charge up a spin attack, which would do more damage and attack in an arc all around you. And eventually, after you found the boots, you could charge up a dash attack where Link would just charge straight on through enemies and would do a small amount of damage going through them. All the while, Link's shield would help protect from incoming projectiles if you happen to line up the sprite just so that the projectile itself would impact the shield. And then of course there were the way the items came into play, things like the boomerang or the hook shot or the bow and arrow, all of which have their own specific contexts in which they're quite useful. Ocarina of Time takes most of that and translates it into 3D, and does it quite successfully, in fact. The sword attacks have been expanded even further. Now instead of just a basic slash and the whirlwind attack, you have combos that you can do. You can continue to press the attack button from different directions and Link will slash in different directions, and eventually, after you press it enough times, then he'll do a combo finishing slash. Like before, Link can charge up a spin attack by holding down the attack button, but unlike the previous games, Link does not have access to the sword beams very early on. It takes a while for him to get access to something akin to that, and that is after he's gained access to magic. He can hold down the attack button to charge up a spin attack, and it'll charge up energy in the sword so that when you release the button and execute the whirlwind attack, it sends out a wave of energy that hits enemies at a bit of a distance. Unlike with the previous games, this does use energy, which you also use for certain special items and of course being able to cast spells, of which there are 3 in the game, one for each of the 3 goddesses that created Hyrule. Although, frankly, the only spell most people actually remember from this thing is Din's Fire, because it shoots out a wave of fire all around Link. Obviously, that can be quite useful in a lot of areas, whereas the other 2 spells are a lot more situational. Anyway, in addition to the basic sword combos and the spin attack, there's also the jump attack, which does more damage than a standard attack, but you do need to be careful about the timing because you only have a limited window during that attack where the attack is actually going to do damage, and until then you can still get clobbered. Link can also roll on the ground as an attack, although it's really not all that useful as an attack. It's really more useful for rolling into things to break crates or knock trees so that things fall out of the branches or that sort of thing. And the rolling attack can be executed by moving and pressing the A button, regardless of whether you're locked onto something or not. If you are locked onto something, then moving forward towards that thing and pressing the A button will do the rolling attack, whereas pressing the A button when you're doing anything else will execute a different type of jump. If you move backward, Link will jump backwards. If you move left or right, then Link will jump to the side, and these can be used to quickly dash around enemies and try to avoid attacks and that sort of thing. So at the time this released, Link's repertoire of combat was the best it had ever been. He was the most nimble he had ever been, and he had the most variety of attacks that he'd ever had. And as for defense, well, unlike in the previous games where blocking with a shield was just an automatic thing, in Ocarina of Time, and from then on out in the 3D games, you would need to press a button to hold the shield up to be able to reflect enemy attacks, or to just block an incoming attack depending on what it was. You do need to be a bit careful with that, however, because the shield you'll get at the beginning of the game, the Deku shield, is made of wood, so if it gets hit with a flame attack, then it burns the shield up and then you're left shieldless. Now if you're dealing with flaming attacks or you're in an environment that is particularly hot like the volcano area, then you're going to want to switch over to the metal shield, which is going to change up the dynamic quite a bit if you're playing during the current time frame in the game, where Link is not strong enough to hold up the shield with just his arms, so he needs to strap it to his back and hunker down whenever he wants to defend himself, which means that your defensive capabilities are a lot more narrow with the metal shield until you get through the time skip, at which point Link is now strong enough to hold it on his arm. And the combat is more than simply slashing at an enemy with your sword and defending with your shield, all the while jumping around to avoid being hit. You have a variety of weapons that can also be bound to the C buttons, which are the inventory slots in this game, of which you now have 3 as opposed to only 1 in the previous games. And in these slots you can of course throw in all the various utility items that you need to solve puzzles, but you also can throw in a variety of weapons, from the hammer, which can just smash through certain enemies' defenses, to ranged weapons like the boomerang or the slingshot or the bow, or even some weapons of more dubious use like the Deku stick, which is mainly better used as a torch, where you hold it out into a flame and then you run over to some other torch sconce and then you can light that torch, or you can burn up webs or whatever. Or the Deku nut, where you throw it on the ground and it acts as a sort of flashbang that stuns enemies briefly. And you do need to be careful when you go up against enemies, because not all of them can be defeated by simply going up and whacking them with your sword. You also need to hit certain enemies in weak spots, or you might need to break through the defenses with the hammer or bombs or something first. And while that sort of thing had already been done to some degree in previous Zelda games, Ocarina of Time is where they really started to experiment a lot more with that, and really did vary up the combat quite a lot from moment to moment. In fact, it's pretty remarkable just how well the combat in this game holds up for being the first attempt at a 3D combat system in a Zelda game. Cause sure, the camera can get in your way sometimes, and the Z-targeting doesn't always work exactly the way you hope it would, but for the most part, the combat works rather well, and the amount of varied enemies that you end up fighting throughout the game makes it so that you're never really getting tired of it. Now sure, there are a few enemy types that are a bit of a pain to fight, but usually they're only in 1 or 2 areas, so you can put up with them long enough to get through that area and then move on to the rest of the game. Things are a bit trickier, however, when you get to the boss fights, which are a pretty big spectacle in this compared to the previous games. Sure, there was some spectacle with the boss fights in previous games, but they were fairly muted affairs, and the boss fights themselves were usually pretty straightforward and simple. Much like with the experimentations in enemy variety, they did some experimenting with the boss fights in this game as well, and for the most part, it actually works out pretty well. Usually when you get to a boss fight, it has a gimmick centered around the item that you picked up while you were in the dungeon. So to give you an example of that from early on in the game, when you're going up against Goma as the boss of the Deku Tree, you have to use the slingshot to shoot the eye so that it will get stunned, and then you can go up and whack that eye with your sword. And sure, that's a really simple gimmick and that boss fight is really easy, but to be fair, that is the first boss fight in the game, and later on the boss fights do get more complicated and more interesting. That's not to say that every boss fight in the game is great though. Some of them are just kind of bland, some of them are kind of annoying, and the final boss fight in particular is a real letdown. It's just kinda lame. But for the most part, the boss fights are a nice capstone on the dungeons, and speaking of the dungeons, those are really the highlight of the game. They're all full of enemies you need to fight, traps that you need to avoid, and puzzles you need to solve, and while the game's never especially difficult, the puzzles can be tricky enough sometimes to where you do need to take a moment to really think about them and figure out what exactly it is that the game is trying to do with them. And unlike in previous Zelda games where the dungeons were relatively homogeneous and the main differences between them were just some slight graphical changes, in Ocarina of Time they made sure that not only do the dungeons look the part, but the challenges and enemies you'll be facing in those dungeons are also appropriate for the given theme of the dungeon. And when everything clicks into place, those dungeons can be incredibly fun to delve through. When everything doesn't click into place though, you get the Water Temple. And I think a lot of people have some misconceptions about what makes the Water Temple so bad. They might think it's the most difficult dungeon in the game or something. It's actually not. It's not a difficult dungeon really at all. It's just that it's an obnoxiously tedious dungeon to go through, and that makes it feel like it just takes absolutely forever to clear the Water Temple. It's so obnoxiously tedious to go through, in fact, that the phrase Water Temple has basically become gaming slang for any dungeon or area in a game that is obnoxiously tedious to go through to the point where it just feels like it's taking absolutely forever. You're constantly having to adjust the water levels in areas, you're having to go into the menu, equip the iron boots, go stomping around submerged areas, go back into your gear menu, unequip the iron boots, float to the surface, and go on to some other area, do something else, and then continue this process over and over and over again throughout the entire dungeon. The 3DS remake does help somewhat in this regard by switching the iron boots from the gear menu over to inventory items, so you can just quickly press the inventory item button that you have it assigned to equip or unequip the iron boots. But even though that does help, the dungeon's still obnoxious to go through, and for a lot of people, it's basically the quit moment. You might be having a great time up to that point, but then you get to the Water Temple and you just get so frustrated with the whole affair that you just decide to put the game aside, and maybe you come back to it later, maybe you don't, but either way, the Water Temple is just awful. So there were definitely some lessons to be learned from that one. But what about the rest of the game? The stuff that's outside of the dungeons, outside of combat, and outside of puzzle solving that's in the dungeons? Well, that's where things really start to get messy. Because traveling from one point to another in this game is also a pretty slow and tedious process, especially before you get access to Epona, who is Link's horse. You can only get access to Epona after the time skip, and even then you have to go through a bit of a process to get her. But once you do get access to Epona, then you can move across the overworld at a pretty high speed, and that is definitely necessary because just running across the entirety of Hyrule Field is slow and annoying, and you have to do it quite frequently. To make matters worse, time only stands still when you're in a town, in a dungeon, or at Lon Lon Ranch. So if you're wandering around the various places of the overworld, then you're going to be subject to the day-night cycle. Now, this is used for some puzzle solving, which is nice and all, but if you're trying to get to Hyrule Town and it switches over to night, then that's a problem, because they raise the drawbridge and you can't get in the town. And even if you're not going to Hyrule Town, if you're just trying to go some other place, then chances are you need to wait for it to be daytime to be able to interact with the various things you're trying to interact with. Now, if you're used to day-night cycles in more recent games, you may not think this is necessarily an issue, but remember, Ocarina of Time was one of the earlier games to do this sort of thing, and in their infinite wisdom, they decided that day is about 2 minutes and 30 seconds. And while nighttime only lasts about 1 minute and 30 seconds, remember that that's 5 minutes for a full day-night cycle. That's not much time to get from one place to another, and when you're wandering around the open world, a lot of times you'll just end up standing around waiting for the day-night cycle to do its thing, and it just gets pretty frustrating and tedious after a while. And that's all in service of an overworld that really doesn't have a whole lot going on. You might run into an enemy here or there, but for the most part, the overworld is not really used for much more than just moving from one place to another, and that means that it just feels kind of wasted. There are certainly some side activities you can do, like the shooting gallery, for example, and there are some side quests you can go on that will get you some extra bonuses, like getting a much bigger wallet so you can hold more rupees, or after completing a very long, very tedious sequence of events, getting access to the Bigoron sword, which is a very large greatsword that is very powerful at the cost of reducing your defensive capabilities, and this is one of the earlier examples of shoehorning a fishing minigame in, but the combination of the amount of wasted space and especially that day-night cycle ultimately makes the overworld travel and mechanics a bit tedious and annoying in this compared to other entries in the series, especially before it. It's certainly not enough to be a deal breaker, but it does wear on you after a while. And speaking of wearing on you after a while, one of the big goals that the developers had for Ocarina of Time is to make the experience a bit more cinematic, which translates to, here, have a bunch of unskippable cutscenes. And very, very slow text crawls. The text is less of an issue in the 3DS remake because they dramatically increase the speed at which the text appears on screen, but in the original N64 version and the GameCube port, that can all drag on quite a while, and while that may not necessarily be all that big of an issue for you if this is your first time playing through the game, it is a problem on subsequent playthroughs, which ironically enough means that the first time you play through the game will probably be your best experience playing through it. Because you'll be experiencing the whole thing for the first time, everything will be new, you won't really know what to expect. You'll be getting caught up in learning all the various songs, finding all of the hidden secrets, finding all of the gold skulltulas. Maybe you go into some of the mini-games and get some of the extra rewards from those. You'll be trying to figure out how to get the Bigoron sword. You'll be trying to learn how to solve the dungeons and such. You're not going to be as concerned with the unskippable cutscenes and the ridiculously slow dialogue. But since the story and the dialogue really aren't good enough to justify being unskippable, you're going to want to focus on the gameplay more than anything else. And you can't really do that when you're forced through unskippable cutscenes and painfully slow dialogue. Is it a deal breaker? Not necessarily, but it is certainly annoying, and that's something that I would really say about the entire experience of Ocarina of Time. It does certainly have quite a few issues, but very few of those issues are actually significant. At worst, they're usually just annoyances, things that get on your nerves but you're able to push through. The only major exception to all of that is the water temple, and even that isn't so bad that you can't push through it. It's a long enough game to where it feels like there's a good amount of content to it, but it's not so long that it overstays its welcome, and even the mechanics that don't work all that well, like say the stealth sections, are pretty easy to excuse as, well, they're still trying to figure that sort of thing out, especially in a general action-adventure context. So by the standards of 3D action-adventure games in 1998, Ocarina of Time's pretty fantastic. But it's been about 24 years since the game originally released, and going back to something that early in the genre's development can be pretty rough if you're used to more modern action-adventure games that have learned from the mistakes that Ocarina of Time made. But despite the many years of development of the action-adventure genre, despite the graphics obviously being rough to go back to, and despite the frame rate especially being rough to go back to, it's incredibly surprising just how easy it is to go back to Ocarina of Time, despite it being one of the earlier examples of a 3D action-adventure game. They got so much right on their first attempt at this sort of thing that it's really easy to see why people hold Ocarina of Time in such high regard, why it is considered one of the best action-adventure games ever made. But where things did get a bit out of hand are the many assertions over the years that Ocarina of Time is the best game ever made. It's not. It's not even the best Zelda game ever made. But it is certainly pretty high up there on the list. And it's a game I will readily recommend to just about everybody. If you are concerned about some of the issues that it has, you might want to take a look at the 3DS remake, since it does remedy some of those major issues, like especially the frame rate, the dialogue sequences being so painfully slow, and of course some of the convenience features of the way the inventory works in it and all that. But even if you don't have access to the 3DS remake and are just trying to play it on, say, the Switch Online expansion pack thing, you're still going to find it's a pretty easy game to pick up and play, and as long as you keep in mind that it was originally released in 1998 and they were still trying to figure out a few of the things that it just doesn't do all that well, you should still be able to enjoy it quite a lot, because it still holds up remarkably well. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting more games for review, or replacing broken equipment, or getting new equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine. I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.